Imagine waking up one morning to find the world around you frozen solid. Rivers stopped mid-flow, forests buried under mountains of ice, and once green lands turned into endless white deserts. This isn't a scene from a movie. It actually happened. Around 12,000 years ago, our planet experienced one of the most mysterious and dramatic climate events in history, a sudden freeze that changed everything. Scientists call it the Younger Dryas, but we can think of it as Earth's forgotten ice age. Before this chilling event, Earth was warming up beautifully after the last ice age. Temperatures were rising, plants were returning, and early humans were beginning to settle, farm, and build the foundations of civilization. Then, almost overnight, something went terribly wrong. Temperatures plummeted, glaciers advanced again, entire species vanished. It was as if someone flipped the planet's climate switch to deep freeze. What caused it? Was it a cosmic impact, a meltwater flood that disrupted ocean currents, or perhaps something even stranger? An event written in ancient myths and legends as the day the Earth stood still. This sudden freeze remains one of the greatest puzzles in Earth's history, a mystery locked in ice and stone. In this documentary, we'll journey back in time to uncover how this mini ice age began, how it reshaped our world, and what it meant for the humans struggling to survive through it. So grab your blanket, settle in, and let's step into the frost-covered pages of Earth's past, where mystery meets science, and the forgotten ice age waits to be. In the soft rhythm of a warming world, Earth was breathing again. The long, bitter grip of the last ice age had finally begun to release its hold. Vast glaciers that once covered continents were retreating northward, leaving behind rivers of meltwater that fed valleys and carved new lakes across the land. The air carried a freshness unseen for thousands of years. Warmer winds brushing across open plains, carrying the scent of blooming vegetation and wet soil. The planet was healing, reborn from the cold. Forests of birch and pine crept slowly across lands that had long been frozen deserts. The tundras began to give way to grasslands filled with herds of reindeer, bison, and mammoths. It was a time of great change, yet also a balance. For the first time in millennia, life seemed to flow with harmony between the warmth of the sun and the rhythms of the earth. Early humans walked these lands, not as conquerors, but as careful observers of the natural world. They followed herds, gathered wild fruits, and learned the ways of the newly awakened environment. Their fires flickered in the twilight, casting soft orange glows against the walls of limestone caves, where stories were painted in red and black pigment, stories of survival, gratitude, and awe. The earth then was quieter. Nights were filled with the distant cries of wolves and the low rumble of rivers melting their icy chains. Daylight lingered longer in the sky, filtered through thin veils of cloud that carried the promise of rain instead of snow. The climate, though still cool by modern standards, was generous compared to the frozen centuries before. In many places, lush meadows stretched where only ice once stood. Flowers like the Arctic poppy and saxifrage began to bloom again, small but resilient, defying the memory of frost. Human communities, the hunter-gatherers of Europe, Asia, and the Americas, thrived during this time. They moved with the seasons, following the migration routes of game animals and settling near rivers swollen with glacial meltwater. They crafted tools from stone, bone, and antler. They learned to fish using nets woven from plant fibers, and they built shelters that blended perfectly with the landscape. These early people lived in rhythm with the planet, guided by instinct and by the stars above. They knew the earth as alive, its moods, its patterns, and its subtle warnings. Yet deep beneath this balance, the planet was changing in ways no one could yet see. The vast ice sheets that still remained over North America and Northern Europe were melting rapidly, pouring trillions of tons of fresh water into the oceans. This meltwater coursed through ancient channels, rushing into the North Atlantic like rivers of life, or perhaps rivers of disruption. Ocean currents, which carried warm water from the tropics toward the poles, began to shift ever so slightly. It was a delicate system, one that had kept global temperatures stable for thousands of years. But like the heartbeat of a great creature, even a small disturbance could change everything. For now, though, the world was calm. The great beasts of the Pleistocene still roamed freely: woolly mammoths, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats. In the north, the air shimmered with the low glow of the aurora borealis. In the south, rains returned to lands that had been parched for centuries. The planet was alive with diversity and motion. Humanity, still in its infancy, had begun to form deeper connections with its surroundings. These early people had no cities, no writing, no empires, only knowledge passed through generations by word and memory. They understood the migration of birds, the ripening of plants, and the cycles of the moon. Their survival depended on this understanding, and their gratitude was expressed through art and ritual. To them the world was sacred. Every river, every storm, every mountain held meaning. As the centuries passed, small communities began to form semi-permanent camps. People started to store food, to build more stable shelters, and to shape tools with greater precision. It was a time of progress, gentle, natural progress, born not from conquest, but from adaptation. The earth was giving them a chance to breathe, to grow, to prepare for the dawn of civilization. But beneath the calm surface, the planet's great systems were shifting. The Atlantic Ocean, though vast and seemingly eternal, was beginning to react to the flood of fresh glacial meltwater. Its salt balance, crucial for the deep circulation that moved heat across the globe, was changing. The invisible conveyor belt of ocean currents, known today as the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, began to slow. To the people of that time, nothing seemed amiss. The skies were still blue, the animals still plentiful, the seasons still turning. But nature, as always, was preparing for balance, and sometimes balance demands chaos. In those days, humans watched the world closely. They could feel subtle shifts that modern science would later measure in data and charts. Perhaps the nights began to feel slightly cooler, or the rains arrived later than before. Perhaps animal herds began to change their routes, following instincts that sensed the coming alteration. The signs were small, barely noticeable. But nature's smallest signs often carry the greatest meaning. The earth was approaching a tipping point. No one could have known that within a single generation, the warmth that had nurtured this age of renewal would collapse into cold once again. Glaciers would surge back across continents, temperatures would fall by double digits, and the dreams of early humanity would be tested by the return of ice. But that story had yet to begin. For now, the planet remained gentle. Rivers flowed steadily, birds sang across open skies, and the last warmth of the post-glacial age bathed the earth in gold. The stage was set for the great freeze that would follow. The shift began quietly, like a whisper carried on the wind. At first, it was nothing more than a subtle coolness that lingered longer in the evenings, a faint chill that brushed across the skin of the earth. The sun still rose golden each morning, spilling its light across the forests and meadows, but something in the balance of warmth began to fade. The air felt different, cleaner, sharper, yet strangely thinner. Animals moved differently too. Herds that once grazed peacefully on open plains began to travel earlier than expected, their migrations marked by unease. The great mammoths, their tusks gleaming like ivory crescents, turned northward as if guided by a silent warning. For the people who lived through this time, the changes were slow but certain. Hunters found that rivers once teeming with fish now ran colder and clearer. Plants that had flourished in the warmer years began to wither at the edges of their leaves. The elders in human tribes, those who had memorized the moods of nature, began to speak in hushed tones around the fire. They noticed that the rains had grown unpredictable. Some seasons arrived too soon, others came too late. In the night sky, the stars appeared sharper, the air more still, and the sounds of insects grew fewer. The earth was holding its breath. Thousands of miles away, at the edge of what is now North America, a silent drama was unfolding, one that would soon change the planet. A vast lake born from the melting glaciers covered an area larger than all the Great Lakes combined. It was called Lake Agassiz. Fed by the retreating ice sheets, it held more water than any human eye could comprehend. But it was not stable. The walls of ice and earth that contained it were fragile, and as the planet warmed, those icy walls began to weaken. Eventually, something gave way. A torrent of cold fresh water burst forth from the lake and rushed into the North Atlantic Ocean. It was a flood of unimaginable scale, trillions of tons of icy water spilling into the sea in a matter of weeks or months. The ocean shuddered under the sudden change. Its delicate system of currents, the conveyor of global heat, was disrupted. The warm waters that had flowed north to keep Europe temperate slowed, and the cold, deep waters that sank beneath them began to lose their strength. It was like unplugging the heart of the ocean. Back on land, people had no words for what was happening beneath the waves. They could only feel the effects. The weather grew unpredictable. Summers became shorter, cooler, and often wet, while winters stretched longer than memory could recall. Snow that once melted in early spring began to linger deep into the season. The ground froze harder. Streams and ponds glazed over earlier than before. In some regions, this cooling arrived like a slow sigh. In others, it struck with sudden ferocity. Storms that came without warning, hail that fell in midsummer, and winds that howled across the open plains as if the earth itself was crying out in confusion. The people adapted as they always had, but their patterns of life began to shift. They stored more food, sought shelter in caves and dense forests, and kept their fires burning longer into the night. Across Europe, forests that had recently expanded now began to thin. Grasses returned where trees once grew, and tundra plants crept southward again. The planet was beginning to reverse itself, retreating into the cold. It wasn't immediate. Centuries passed before the full force of the freeze was felt. But for a planet that measures time in billions of years, it was almost instantaneous. Scientists, thousands of years later, would call this event the Younger Dryas, named after a small Arctic flower that began to bloom across Europe once more. A flower that only thrives in cold climates. Its seeds, preserved in ancient layers of soil, told the story of how swiftly the warmth vanished. Within just a few decades, global temperatures plunged. The North Atlantic region, once mild and wet, turned cold and dry. In Greenland, temperatures dropped by as much as 10 degrees Celsius. Imagine that change, an entire climate shifting in what, for nature, amounts to the blink of an eye. Rivers froze, lakes shrank, and glaciers began to creep forward again. The very rhythm of the planet had faltered. The early humans who lived through it must have felt confusion before fear. For generations, their ancestors had spoken of a world warming, of animals returning, of plants blooming, a time of renewal. Now, those promises were fading. Food grew scarcer, game animals migrated away from traditional hunting grounds, and the land hardened beneath the frost. The same people who had once painted celebrations of abundance now painted the hunt for survival. Still, they endured. They built stronger shelters, carved tools with finer precision, and huddled closer in community. Their fires became symbols of hope, small circles of warmth in a growing world of cold. When snow covered their trails, they read the stars for direction. When the rivers froze solid, they learned to track animals by the sound of their breath in the still air. Humanity's resilience, born in the ancient ice, awoke once again, and yet the cold deepened. Year after year, generation after generation, the frost reached farther south. The lush meadows and rivers that had sustained life began to fade into silence. Mammoths that had once thrived now struggled to find food. Saber-toothed cats and giant sloths, already rare, vanished completely in some regions. It was as though the earth was quietly erasing one chapter to begin another. What caused this sudden return to ice? Was it simply the collapse of ocean currents? Or did something greater strike the planet, perhaps a comet or meteor impact, leaving behind shock and dust that cooled the skies? Even today, the evidence remains scattered, debated, and partly hidden beneath the layers of time. But for those who lived it, the cause didn't matter. What mattered was survival. They watched as snow fell on lands that had never known snow. They listened to the silence that came after each storm, when the world seemed frozen in thought. And deep within their hearts, they must have wondered if the warmth would ever return. The freeze had begun, slow, silent, and unstoppable.
The cold came slowly at first, as though the earth herself was drawing in a long breath before the silence. The skies dimmed, the winds grew sharper, and the mornings arrived wrapped in frost. Then, almost without warning, the transformation was complete. The world that had once glowed with soft sunlight and the hum of life turned pale and quiet. The warmth that had nurtured rivers, meadows, and forests was gone, replaced by the creeping hand of ice. Across the northern hemisphere, glaciers began to advance once more. Sheets of ice hundreds of meters thick rolled slowly over the land like living creatures, crushing trees, boulders, and valleys beneath their immense weight. The air grew dry, because cold air could no longer hold moisture. Snow still fell, but it was light and powdery, carried on relentless winds that sculpted the land into endless dunes of white. The sound of the world changed too. No longer the babble of streams or the chirping of birds, but the whisper of wind across frozen plains. For early humans, life became an unending test of endurance. Camps that once thrived near lakes and rivers now stood surrounded by ice. Hunters found fewer animals, and those that remained grew lean and wary. Mammoths migrated to distant tundras, reindeer moved in smaller herds, and many smaller creatures burrowed deep or vanished altogether. The land itself seemed to retreat from life. Still, humanity refused to fade. Fires burned longer through the night, their smoke curling into a sky of faint auroras and drifting ice crystals. People gathered in tighter groups, their shelters built from mammoth bones, hides, and stone. They huddled together, sharing warmth, food, and hope. The crackle of fire became the heartbeat of civilization, a soft defiance against the cold. Inside these shelters, stories were told. Myths began to take shape about the spirits of ice and wind, about ancient beasts that carried the cold on their backs. Around every flame, children listened to the elders describe the days of warmth, tales of green valleys and flowing water, stories of animals that no longer roamed. Memory became the bridge between what was and what had been lost. In the dark of the Ice Age, imagination was a form of survival. The environment itself was transforming. Forests withdrew southward, leaving behind barren tundras dotted with hardy shrubs and moss. The great rivers of meltwater from the earlier warming now froze solid, their surfaces gleaming under the dim light of the sun. Lakes shrank, their edges turning to crystal, trapping ancient fish beneath their surfaces. Even the sea ice expanded, covering parts of the northern ocean that had once been open water. The atmosphere changed as well. Dust and ice crystals drifted high above, reflecting sunlight and deepening the chill. Winters stretched endlessly, and summers, if they could still be called summers, were brief and cold. The growing season for plants became shorter than ever, forcing both animals and humans to rely on what little could be gathered or hunted. The balance between life and death grew thin. Yet, amid this frozen silence, beauty still existed. The aurora danced across the night sky in ribbons of green and violet, lighting the snow with an ethereal glow. Ice crystals hung in the air like stars fallen to earth. In the deep stillness of night, when the wind paused for a moment, one could hear the faint cracking of distant glaciers, the slow breathing of a planet dreaming beneath its blanket of frost. In places where the cold was less severe, sheltered valleys or regions near the coasts, pockets of life persisted. Humans here found refuge, adapting their tools and habits to meet the new demands of the environment. They crafted clothing from layered furs, built stronger hearths, and learned to store food through the endless winters. They followed the great herds southward, across newly exposed land bridges that connected continents. It was during this time, scientists believe, that humans crossed into new worlds, including the Americas, following mammoths and bison across icy plains. The deep freeze, though merciless, was also a bridge, connecting lands and people who would one day shape the world anew. Everywhere, signs of change were written in the landscape. In caves, stalactites stopped growing as dripping water froze. In open fields, the bones of ancient creatures lay preserved in frost, waiting for future eyes to rediscover them. Each gust of wind carried tiny particles of history, the dust of glacial rock, ground down over centuries, drifting like ghostly reminders of the planet's memory. Modern science. The Younger Dryas stands as one of the most abrupt climate reversals in Earth's history. But to those who lived it, there were no measurements, only sensations. The tightening cold in their lungs, the distant cracking of ice at night, the pale sun that refused to warm their skin. Their knowledge came through observation, instinct, and adaptation. They didn't fight nature. They learned to move with it. And still, they must have wondered, what had angered the world? Why had the warmth vanished? Some may have believed that the spirits of the sky had turned away. Others might have thought the earth was resting, asleep beneath its blanket of snow. To them, the planet was alive, and the cold was simply another mood in its endless cycle of creation and renewal. Generations passed under the ice. Whole lifetimes unfolded without ever knowing the gentle warmth their ancestors had once felt. Yet even as glaciers expanded and storms howled, the pulse of humanity continued. Children were born, stories were told, fires burned, fragile yet unbroken. The human spirit, like the flicker of flame, refused to die. As the centuries stretched on, the cold reached its height. Glaciers covered vast portions of the northern world once again, locking away oceans and lowering sea levels. The Earth's reflectivity increased, bouncing sunlight back into space and trapping the planet in its frozen slumber. It was a feedback loop, one that seemed endless. But even within the heart of the cold, change was quietly stirring. Deep in the oceans, the currents began to shift once more. In the atmosphere, carbon levels slowly rose. The planet, though frozen on its surface, was still alive within. It was waiting, slowly, patiently, for the balance to tip again. For humanity, the worst of the freeze was yet to pass, but so too was the beginning of it. Long after the winds had carved their stories across the frozen plains, the question remained: why had the world turned so suddenly cold? For the people who lived through it, there had been no warning, no single sign of anger from the heavens, only the slow fading of warmth, the silence that followed. To the scientists of the far future, the evidence would rest locked inside ice itself, layer upon layer of frozen memory waiting to be read. In the cores of Greenland and Antarctica, bubbles of ancient air would tell the tale. When those cylinders of ice were finally drilled thousands of years later, Each slice of translucent blue revealed a heartbeat of the past, the rhythm of temperature, dust, and gas across time. Within them, a sharp line could be seen, a sudden drop, a mark where warmth collapsed into cold. The Earth had shifted almost overnight. But what had pulled the lever? Some clues pointed toward the sea. The ocean, vast and seemingly eternal, is the great carrier of heat on this planet. Through its slow, circulating currents, it moves warmth from the tropics to the poles, keeping climates balanced and seasons gentle. Yet that system is fragile, a dance between salt, temperature, and depth. When the meltwaters from the great northern ice sheets poured into the Atlantic, they freshened the surface and broke that rhythm. Without the weight of salt to drive it downward, the warm current could not sink. It faltered, and with it went the global flow of heat. Europe chilled first, then the world followed. It is a simple idea, but nature seldom moves through simple paths. Other scientists found traces that spoke of fire rather than flood. In thin layers of clay scattered across continents, they discovered microscopic beads of glass, spherules born from unimaginable heat. These tiny marbles, smooth and metallic, hinted at a cosmic visitor, a comet or meteor that may have struck the Earth or exploded in the sky. If true, it would have thrown dust and vapor into the atmosphere, dimming the sun and cooling the world within months. Some evidence even suggested a layer rich in platinum and iridium, elements rare on Earth but common in celestial rock. The theory stirred debate, and still does. Could a single impact have reset the planet's climate? Or had the Earth's own systems already been so delicately balanced that any small disturbance, a flood, a burst of fire, a shift in orbit, might have been enough? The truth may be a blend of many forces, converging like threads in a tapestry. The oceans, the atmosphere, the sun's quiet cycles, and the living feedback of the biosphere itself. Whatever the cause, the result was written everywhere. In the sediments of northern lakes, a sudden return of cold-loving pollen marked the fall of temperature. In cave stalagmites, the chemical fingerprints of drought and chill appeared at the same moment. Even coral reefs, deep in tropical waters, bore subtle scars, rings of slower growth where the planet's pulse had weakened. The Younger Dryas was not local. It was global, a reminder that Earth's systems are bound together like organs in a single body. Yet amid all this scientific wonder, there is something more human in the mystery. Imagine the first people to notice the sky change. They would have watched as familiar constellations shimmered behind thin veils of cold mist as the seasons lost their rhythm. They did not know of currents or comets, but they felt the story through the soles of their feet, through the sound of cracking ice on the river and the taste of snow in the wind. Their understanding was spiritual, intuitive, woven into myth. To them, the world's chill might have been the breath of a sleeping giant, or the turning of a great cosmic wheel. Today, as researchers compare data and models, the same sense of wonder lingers, a recognition that we are reading the diary of a living planet. Every isotope ratio, every trapped bubble of ancient air, every grain of cosmic dust is a letter in that diary. It reminds us how delicate the balance truly is. A slight shift in salinity, a brief veil of dust, a few degrees of temperature, and entire ecosystems transform. Some scientists see in the Younger Dryas a warning. If the oceans could falter once, they could falter again. The very conveyor that warms modern Europe still depends on the same fragile physics. Dense salty water sinking in the north, warm water flowing to replace it. Melt too much ice today, and the process could slow anew. The echoes of the past murmur softly through modern climate models, like ghosts whispering from beneath the ice. But there is also reassurance in the story. The Earth recovered. The deep freeze lasted little more than 1,000 years, a heartbeat in geological time, before warmth returned. When the Atlantic currents strengthened once more, the sun's energy poured back into the northern world, and the planet awoke from its sleep. The ice retreated, rivers ran freely again, and life rushed to fill the emptiness. The Younger Dryas, for all its mystery, was a moment of pause, a reminder of resilience, both planetary and human. Still, questions remain unanswered. Was the trigger celestial or earthly? Did the comet fall, or did the sea simply sigh? Perhaps both, or neither. Perhaps the cause matters less than the lesson. that the Earth's balance is alive, capable of sudden moods and quiet recoveries. And that within those shifts, humanity finds both challenge and renewal. As the frost began, somewhere deep within the core of the planet, warmth still moved. Molten rocks circulating beneath ancient crust, heat rising in silence, waiting to reawaken the surface. Even as glaciers spread, the heart of the world kept burning, patient and steady. In that hidden pulse lay the promise that the freeze would not last forever. The world had fallen into silence, but humanity refused to disappear. Even as the frost deepened and the sun lost its warmth, people endured. Across the continents, small groups of humans huddled in caves, in valleys, and by the edges of frozen rivers, flickers of life scattered like sparks across a darkened world. They had seen the warmth fade, had watched the forests retreat, and yet their hearts carried a quiet certainty that survival was still possible, that the earth would one day breathe again. For these people, life was not about comfort. It was about rhythm, patience, and resilience. Every sunrise, no matter how dim, was a promise that the planet still turned. They rose before dawn, wrapped in hides of mammoth and reindeer, their breath forming white clouds in the frozen air. Men and women worked together to mend tools, repair shelters, and track the movements of animals. Children learned early to listen, to hear the snow crack underfoot, to sense the wind's direction, to recognize the faint smell of smoke or prey carried by the air. Hunting became both art and ritual. Spears tipped with flint and bone were shaped with care, balanced perfectly for flight. Arrows were hardened in fire and fletched with the feathers of winter birds. Every hunt required patience, hours of silent waiting, every breath measured. The reindeer and bison were cautious now, their numbers smaller, their migrations unpredictable. Sometimes hunters returned with nothing but frost on their eyelashes and the whisper of failure in their hearts. But even then, the fires in their camps burned on. Fire was everything. It was life, warmth, protection, and memory. Around it, people gathered not just to survive, but to stay human, to share food, to tell stories, to remember who they were. The flames lit the walls of caves where ancient hands painted scenes of the world as it once had been. Animals running through green meadows, rivers flowing, the sun shining over open skies. These paintings were not just art. They were acts of hope, visions of warmth preserved in color against the cold. The sound of the wind outside often blended with the soft murmurs of voices inside. Elders spoke of cycles, of how the world sleeps and wakes, freezes and thaws, dies and returns to life. They told their children that the cold would not last forever, that the earth had its reasons, and that patience was the key to survival. These lessons were as vital as food and fire. They were the inheritance of endurance. Across the frozen continents, human ingenuity blossomed quietly. In the lands that would one day become Europe, people of the Magdalenian and later cultures crafted tools of astonishing precision. Needles of bone to sew clothing, harpoons to catch fish beneath the ice, ornaments carved with patterns that might have symbolized the stars. In the Middle East, near what is now Turkey and the Levant, small groups began to gather wild grains, grinding them into coarse flour, a simple act that would one day spark agriculture itself. Even in the coldest times, humanity was learning to shape the future. In Asia, bands of people followed the reindeer herds across the steppe, moving with the seasons, never staying too long in one place. In the Americas, recently populated through icy corridors of the north, families built shelters from bones and hides, warming them with oil lamps made from carved stone. In each corner of the earth, adaptation took a different form, yet the spirit was the same. Resourcefulness, community, and an unbreakable belief in life. There were moments of awe, too, moments when even hardship gave way to beauty. The night skies, clearer than ever before, glittered with millions of stars. The aurora shimmered in ghostly colors, sweeping across the heavens like rivers of light. Beneath those lights, people sang songs to the spirits of the sky, believing they were watching the dance of ancestors. The cold world above became a mirror of the firelight below, both reminders that light can exist even in the deepest dark. Animals, too, continued their struggle. The mammoth, once king of the plains, grew thinner as grasslands shrank. The woolly rhinoceros and cave lion neared their end. But the smaller, more adaptable creatures, foxes, wolves, birds, survived, following humans, learning to share their scraps, and perhaps finding in mankind a strange ally. It was during these long, frozen centuries that wolves began to draw closer to human fires, seeking warmth and leftover bones. From this quiet companionship, the story of the first dogs was born, another spark of cooperation in a frozen world. The cold tested not just the body but the mind. Isolation, hunger, and loss pressed heavily on those who lived through the Younger Dryas. Yet within that struggle, the seeds of empathy and cooperation grew stronger. Survival depended not on strength alone, but on kindness, on sharing food, helping the weak, and raising children together. These bonds, formed in the ice, became the foundation of civilization. As the centuries passed, the world slowly adapted to its own stillness. Forests waited dormant under layers of snow. Rivers carved new paths under the ice. Mountains wore fresh crowns of white. The air itself seemed thinner, more sacred, filled with a quiet kind of holiness. To live then was to be part of something vast, a reminder that humans were not masters of the earth, but threads within its great fabric. There were still signs of change ahead. Deep underground, the Earth's warmth pulsed quietly. Volcanoes released faint streams of ash into the air. The planet's orbit shifted ever so slightly, letting the sun's rays creep closer once again. Slowly, imperceptibly, the balance began to tilt. Somewhere far to the south, plants began to grow a little faster. Snow melted earlier. Migrating birds returned a few days sooner than before. The end of the deep freeze was coming, though no one yet knew it. For the humans who had lived generations in the cold, survival had become identity. They did not expect the world to grow warm again, but nature, as always, had its own rhythm. The earth had endured, and so had they, the flame that had burned through the darkness. The fire of will, memory, and adaptation had carried humanity safely through the frozen night. And soon, that flame would light the first dawn of a new world. The change began quietly, so quietly that no one could have noticed it at first. There was no thunderclap, no sudden breaking of the cold. Only a gentler wind, a softer dawn, a day that seemed to last a little longer than the one before. The air, once sharp as broken glass, began to soften. The deep white silence of the world started to stir, as if the earth itself had taken a long, slow breath after 10,000 years of sleep. The glaciers that had ruled the continents began to shift. They cracked and groaned under their own ancient weight, their icy hearts beginning to melt from within. Streams of blue water trickled down their sides, gathering into rivers that carved through valleys once buried in frost. In the distance, mountains wept waterfalls again. The sound of flowing water, that gentle, eternal song, returned to a world that had almost forgotten those who lived through the end of the cold. The change felt like awakening. The nights grew shorter, and the days shimmered with strange new warmth. Frost melted from the trees. Small green shoots appeared along the edges of thawing ground, fragile, trembling, yet filled with fierce determination. The smell of soil returned. The air carried the scent of life again. Animals were the first to notice. Herds that had dwindled began to wander north once more, following instinct older than memory. Birds returned, filling the skies with cries that echoed over the melting plains. Fish swam upriver to spawn in waters that had been frozen for centuries. Everywhere, motion returned, a pulse of renewal spreading across the earth. For the humans who survived the long freeze, this new warmth brought both wonder and fear. The world was changing again, but change had long been the messenger of hardship. They watched the snow retreat and the rivers swell, unsure whether this was salvation or another test. Yet, slowly, hope took root where frost once ruled. The people began to move, leaving behind caves and valleys, following the animals and rivers into new lands that in these migrations, humanity rediscovered abundance. Berries and roots grew again. Herds multiplied. Woodlands spread, offering shelter and firewood. Families built larger camps, and the sense of stability returned for the first time in generations. The ice had not only shaped their bodies, stronger, leaner, built for endurance, it had shaped their minds. They had learned patience, cooperation, and respect for the power of nature. Now, those lessons became the foundation of renewal. The great rivers of the Thaw carried more than water. They carried stories. They carried silt and stone, carving the landscapes we know today: the valleys of the Rhine, the plains of the Mississippi, the fjords of Norway, the Great Lakes of North America. Everywhere the ice withdrew, it left behind scars and gifts: fertile soil, fresh lakes, and new coastlines. The map of the world itself was rewritten by the melt that in some places, the retreat of the ice was dramatic. Whole walls of glacier collapsed, sending waves roaring through the valleys. Vast meltwater floods swept across continents, reshaping everything in their path. In North America, one such flood, from the breaking of the Laurentide ice sheet, carved out river systems so immense they could still be seen from space today. It was as though the planet had begun to sculpt itself anew. But even as the world thawed, it did not do so evenly. The Earth was waking slowly, unevenly, like a sleeper stretching one limb at a time. Some regions warmed quickly, turning green within centuries. Others remained cold, locked in ice long after the first flowers bloomed in the south. This patchwork of climates created new challenges: storms, floods, droughts, all part of the Earth's slow return to balance. Amid all this, humans began to settle. They discovered that seeds, when planted, grew into food. They learned that animals could be tamed, bred, and herded. These discoveries were not accidents, but the quiet rewards of observation, born from generations of watching the rhythms of nature during the ice. In places like the Fertile Crescent, the valleys of the Tigris, Euphrates, and Jordan rivers, the first true villages emerged. Clay huts replaced temporary shelters. The age of wandering was ending as the glaciers retreated farther north. They left behind vast grasslands, wide, open spaces that invited exploration. Hunters followed mammoth trails, but soon found new animals: aurochs, deer, wild horses, better suited to the warming world. Fishing became an essential way of life, as rivers teemed with life again. The human diet diversified, and with it, their populations grew. The warmth also brought back color, not just to the land, but to human life. Pigments once scarce became abundant again. People painted not just for survival, but for joy. Cave walls, pottery, and tools carried new patterns: spirals, suns, and flowing lines inspired by the changing seasons. Music, too, began to echo once more through valleys: flutes carved from bone, drums made from stretched hide, the sound of rhythm and harmony returning to a world of balance. Yet, within this rebirth lay a quiet farewell. Many of the great beasts that had shared the frozen world, mammoths, woolly rhinos, giant sloths, began to disappear. Some could not adapt to the warming climate. Others fell to the skill of human hunters. The Ice Age giants vanished, leaving behind bones buried in the soft earth, their stories becoming whispers in stone. Humanity, for the first time, began to stand alone as the dominant species of the planet. With the melting of ice came the rise of oceans. The waters, long locked away in glaciers, returned to the seas, swallowing ancient coastlines. Lands that had once connected continents vanished beneath the waves. Doggerland, the great plain between Britain and Europe, sank beneath the North Sea. The land bridge between Siberia and Alaska disappeared, isolating the Americas. In this way, the world of the Ice Age gave birth to the continents we know now. For those who watched the waters rise, the transformation must have felt like magic or warning. Whole valleys filled with sea. Familiar hunting grounds vanished. But with loss came discovery: new coasts, new islands, and new horizons to explore. Humans had always been wanderers, and even as the Earth changed, their curiosity burned brighter than ever. The Earth was alive again, breathing, moving, reshaping itself in cycles of death and renewal. The glaciers that had once silenced rivers now fed them. The forests that had vanished now spread across the continents, breathing oxygen into the skies. The air filled with the scent of pine and rain. For the first time in thousands of years, spring returned to every corner of the world that in this awakening, humans began to dream differently. No longer mere survivors, they became builders. They looked to the sky and saw not only the stars of winter but the promise of time, the passing of seasons, the rhythm of life itself. They began to measure, to count, to plant, to plan. The memory of the ice remained within them, but it no longer defined them. It taught them humility, and that lesson guided them into the dawn of civilization. And as warmth spread, the earth glittered with new beginnings. Rivers carried the reflection of a bluer sky. Forests stretched toward the horizon. The air thrummed with the hum of insects, the calls of birds, and the laughter of humankind rediscovering joy. The frozen world had finally released its hold, and from its grip, a new chapter in Earth's story began, one written not in ice, but in sunlight. Thanks watching for video channel Galaxy Groove, like, subscribe, and share.